The Owl House and Amphibia have both finished, and I have had a lot of time to watch and rewatch these shows. And I've done it, and I've done it gladly. The shows are good. I'm not quite sure they are classics on the level of Gravity Falls or Avatar and Korra, but they are strong, thoughtful, vibrant shows about community, about relationships, about trying to rebuild a sense of lost connection in an uncertain world. And even beyond that, about forging the capacity to realize when connections are lost, when there is a problem, when a relationship no longer feels organic and vital, when it has become corroded by indifference and puerile platitudes and rot has developed beneath the surface. On a superficial level, the shows are quite similar because they are about girls around the same age being swept away to a different magical world where they have all kinds of strange and magical adventures and eventually try to get home. Sometimes it can seem strange that Luce and Anne are so close in age, and that Luce is actually the older one, considering how much older Anne seems. And yet, the parallels remain, and not just on a superficial level. These shows necessitate introspection. They have a bit of an existentialist bent to them, as characters must, when confronted with these estranging experiences, these experiences that subvert and undermine their pre-established values and belief systems, must go inside themselves. They must introspect. They must reflect. And in doing so, they realize that their beliefs about themselves, who they are, and what they want are not as clear and as certain as they once anticipated. They realize that ultimately they're holding on to fundamentally rigid and stiff and insufficient images of themselves that do not reflect the fullness and the multiplicitous, pluralistic intensity of their experiences in the world, experiences that fundamentally overwhelm these childish self-concepts and force them to reconsider themselves in the world. Not to be too abstract about this, but Luce is a bit of an existentialist hero, and so is Anne to an extent. To be more concrete, Luce is fundamentally a character who is in a difficult position. She does not like her home in Connecticut. It's not the worst thing in the world, but she feels isolated, and she feels alienated from those around her. And she lashes out in ways that are not particularly helpful. She views her mom more negatively, perhaps, than she should. We know who Camilla is by the end of the show, but at the start we see her only through Luce's eyes, and Luce views her more negatively. Luce also is quick to be a little selfish at the start, to over-prioritize her own well-being and her own prosperity over that of others, such as when she correctly laments how people at the school do not treat her well, but really does not care much that she is the one who literally set a bunch of snakes on them. That's the kind of thinking that Luce so often falls into. It's fundamentally egocentric. Not necessarily in a bad or villainous way, but just in the way that a lot of us shows often are, especially when we're that age, where I and what I want is the most important thing in the world. And ultimately, Luce has to grow beyond that thinking. She has to go beyond merely thinking of herself as a victim who needs to escape. That narrative is not false, but ultimately, once she does get a glimpse of this other world, she realizes that she is incomplete too. And though she appreciates the freedom of this other world, she ultimately needs to reflect on who she really wants to be. And she grows and ultimately is able to help others, from Amity to the Collector. And it is through helping others that she is able to help herself become a more mature and thoughtful person. Anne's story is not quite that elaborate, but it's also only 1/3 of the show. Anne does not have confidence in herself. She does not have a coherent I, a coherent sense of self, and so she globs on to this friend group to provide her that. And this unproductive dynamic ultimately leads to her empowering Sasha's worst tendencies. So that's who Anne is, and ultimately she develops healthier and more robust relationships with the planters and with others in Amphibia. And she becomes a more full and more thoughtful person. And the others have their journeys as well. Journeys that aren't merely offshoots of Anne, even as they parallel Anne's journey. Sasha's journey throughout Amphibia is probably the most interesting, at least to me, because she's not the worst person in the world. She's not this rote bully character. She's not even like Amity, someone who is pressured into pressuring others. She has not had a great home life, and she wants to be this heroic, noble force for her friends, whom she deeply loves and cares about. But she ultimately needs to accept that her friends need to forge their own paths, that she cannot live their lives for them, and she cannot dictate what is best for them, even if she believes she's right, and even if she is right. The band episode demonstrates this quite astutely, the one right before the finale of Season 2. Sasha's comments about Anne's music are probably correct. Sasha is much better at this on a technical level than Anne or Marcy are, but ultimately that doesn't matter. They need to go and make their own lives and do their own things if the three of them are to really succeed as a friend group. Marcy, of course, has her own story where she feels such alienation from her life that she runs away. And she gets them all trapped in this world, and she loves Amphibia, and it gives her a place apart from the stifling influences at home, a place where she can really prove herself, and she does. But she also errs. She also is stuck prioritizing her own concept of what's best for everyone, and ultimately her own desire to maintain her friendships with the girls, with Anne and Sasha, over what's organically best for the three of them as individuals, or for the friend group as a whole. So, the shows are similar in that regard, but they ultimately differ in that they end very differently. Now, of course, there are differences between the shows that aren't just delegated to the endings, but the endings most exemplify the differences between these shows. Amphibia's ending is ultimately more melancholic. Perhaps I'm a bit of a cynic, but it feels more truthful. I'm not sure it quite feels organic to the show. They could have done more to lead up to this, but the three of them deciding that as much as they treasure their friendship, they need to accept that they can't be as close as they were as kids, that oversimplistic conception of their friendship may have worked when they were very young, but considering they are growing into adults, they need to take time to develop their own senses of who they are. And once they do that, they can come back together and they can be friends again, as we see at the end of the show, but there needs to be that separation. Again, I'm not sure it's the perfect ending for the show. I really wish they could have spent a little more time on Marcy, someone who has perhaps not unjustifiable reasons for not being so happy and quick to simply return home. After all, she was willing to completely live in Amphibia forever and never return home. So her sense of estrangement from her ordinary world is, I think, wrapped up a little too quickly, but the ideas behind the ending are good, wistful, and quite thoughtful. Slightly melancholic, and gives these characters an ending that's ultimately right for their growth as people, but is not necessarily the ending they would want for themselves. The Owl House's ending is much more optimistic, which in a sense fits the show, which has always been optimistic. It's not a purely positive show, and there are a lot of darker moments, especially in Season 2. And into Season 3, Luce is quite wearied by the end of the show. Compare Season 1 Luce to Season 3 Luce, and you see, number one, how much she's grown, but number two, how deeply and deleteriously her experiences have affected her. They have made her less trusting and more melancholic, much to the discontent of all the people she helped out of their sorrow and laments. But aside from Balos, who is apparently purely evil, everyone else in the show, more or less, is flawed but not horrible. They can be made better. The Owl House fundamentally has faith in the value of community to restore people, to instill in them a sense of closeness to others and a sense of personal self-worth that healthily inspires people to act more justly and more virtuously. We see this happen from Amity to Hunter, and we even see that it might happen to the Collector one day, even though he's not quite there yet. As similar as they are fundamentally shows with different philosophical statements about friendship and community. These are not superficial differences, they fundamentally define what the shows are. Both shows oppose the stultifying, sterile block that so often counts as common sense. As William James so eloquently talks about, what common sense is often just the collection of mores and social standards from the past. They build up to such an extent that we take them for granted, instead of analyzing them, instead of wondering where they come from and how they develop. William James ardently believes that the truth is always being made. It's not something we can simply find, like a hidden gem, just by thinking properly. It must be actively made based on our vital engagement with our real experiences. And both these shows tend to agree. It's not like if Anne just reasoned enough, she would figure out what she needed to learn. She had to go through those experiences. She had to have her preconceptions shattered. Only then could she organically move into a more thoughtful conception of herself and the world around her, and the same applies to Luce. But ultimately, Amphibia believes that while community and friendship can enhance the self, it can also trap the self in these rigid and oversimplistic conceptions of what is beneficial to ourselves and others. And ultimately, we need to be willing to critique or even leave behind those friendships, not because they're bad or toxic, a word that is too often overused, but because they become mechanical, they become dogmatic, they become simple things that we go through because they're a part of our routine. Sasha is my friend because she's always been my friend. Instead of actually thinking about, why? Why do I consider her a friend? What do I get from considering her a friend as a person? How does this benefit me? Not in a utilitarian way, but in a holistic, emotional, psychological way. Am I a better person because of this friendship or not? The Owl House is ultimately more optimistic. It believes that these friendships, while not always perfect, are ultimately beneficial to the growth of wearied and broken individuals who cannot always trust what they start out considering as a sense of community, a sense of familial love and trust. Hunter and Amity especially are betrayed by people they really should be getting familial love from. Instead, it's this patchwork community that loves each other and ultimately encourages each other to be better. So, both shows are optimistic, but they take fundamentally different approaches to self-improvement. And that is made very clear by their differing endings. Both are good. I think I prefer the Owl House's ending as an extension of what the show has always been about. While the Amphibia ending, while more awkward in relation to the rest of the show, which does a lot to promote the friendship, ultimately feels more philosophically true, to me, at least. But tell me what you think. Tune in soon for next analysis. It will be coming soon. That I can promise you. Thank you all again. Thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. These shows are both good. Keep watching them. Adios, comrades.